Thanks, Chris, for the introduction. So today I'd like to talk about the generalizability of different samples that we use in security surveys. So in the past about 5 years, over 30 papers in the top 4 security conferences have used a survey in which users or developers responded to some human-written questions. And over 100 security-related papers have appeared in other conferences also using survey measures. And often a question that we have about these surveys we conduct is how generalizable they are. So when we go out and we request responses, are we really representing, say, the opinions of the US population or the opinions of some set of developers? And so in the talk today, we're going to explore how generalizable different surveys about security and privacy are in the US in particular. To back up for a minute, we should talk about the ingredients of surveys. So when you're conducting a survey, you have some set of research questions you want to answer, some set of constructs that you're going to use to answer those research questions, and then you're going to design a set of survey questions in order to measure those constructs. So in a more traditional measurement kind of style, we would identify some metrics and write some code in order to record those metrics. In this case, we're going to write some words in order to measure these constructs using survey questions. After we've asked our questions, written our questions, we're going to collect a sample of responses to those questions. So we very rarely can ask all of the people that we want to talk to, so we take a subset of them. And finally, we do some statistical analysis to ultimately answer our research questions. Today's talk is going to focus on the sample portion. If you're curious about the questions portion, we had some work in CCS 2018 looking at the differences between answers to surveys and log data results. OK, so what are the types of survey samples that are out there that we could possibly use? The most expensive and typically kind of the gold standard survey sample is a probabilistic survey sample. So these kind of surveys are conducted only via telephone or on paper. And the reason for that is that you need to have a sampling frame that gives you a one-to-one matching between people in a population, like say the US, and a telephone number or mailing address. So you need to have a non-zero chance of reaching anyone in the population. And in the case of telephone surveys, they'll match them up with mailing address samples. They'll figure out who doesn't have telephone access in a particular demographic they'd like to sample, and they will actually go give those people telephone access so they're reachable for the survey. What this non-zero chance of reaching everyone in the population allows you to do is it allows you to do statistical weighting once you actually get your responses back to figure out how well you actually captured all of the possible opinions in a population. So as a quick example of this kind of weighting, if I have a population of animals in the jungle, there's 1,000 animals in the jungle, I'm going to throw an ice cream party for the animals. But I don't have time to go survey every single animal about what flavor of ice cream they want. So I take a random sample of 100 animals in the jungle, and only 40 of the tigers actually respond to my survey. So there's 50% tigers in the whole population, but only 40% tigers in my sample. And therefore, since tigers have different preferences from the other animals, if I generalize just from the sample, my results are going to be a bit off. So I need to do some weighting. And in order to do that weighting, I'm going to look at the ratios of the tigers in the whole population to the ratio of tigers I got in my sample. And I'm going to weight up the responses of the tigers in my sample by 25%. So I'm going to say, well, instead of actually needing 10 chocolate ice creams, I need 12.5 chocolate ice creams, and then times 10 in order to have an ice cream party that meets everybody's requirements. And if I hadn't done this weighting, I would have reached a different conclusion about the prevalence of tigers' opinions on ice cream. This is the same idea for probabilistic surveys. Now, these probabilistic surveys are very, very expensive to conduct because you need a lot of statisticians, you need people to be calling up folks on the telephone or mailing out surveys, so on and so forth. So we have other alternatives. There are nearly probabilistic samples where you recruit people to be part of a survey panel where they're going to be asked to take many surveys, but they're recruited in a probabilistic way. We have census-representative non-probability samples. So this is where people are asked to take part in a survey panel through airline frequent flyer programs, church charities, so on and so forth. They get asked to do a couple of surveys every month, and they get paid for doing so. If you use one of these panels, you can get respondents whose demographics look like the US population, but you can't do this kind of weighting because these participants weren't randomly sampled, and they're a little bit different than your average participant because they get surveyed a lot. Then, of course, you have crowdsourced samples, and this is what the majority of surveys are that are in the security community. So crowd workers do tasks for small amounts of money, 10 cents, couple of dollars, and they were traditionally doing work that would help with machine learning labeling. Now they're often answering researchers' surveys. But they differ from the general population in that they spend a great deal of their time online doing these tasks. They also tend to be younger and actually better educated than the general US population. And finally, we have convenient samples. So these are very, very cheap. This is like I go and post on my Twitter, and I ask everyone at S&P to take a survey, and then I write an S&P paper next year, and I say, great, I know how the US opinion feels about privacy because I asked people who are on my Twitter feed. Sometimes these can be useful, but they end up with a lot of biases based on the sampling. OK, so in this work, we compared this probabilistic, randomly sampled telephone data with a census-representative web panel and with Amazon Mechanical Turk. And you can see the differences in pricing for collecting these surveys at the bottom. OK, so we compared answers to questions about internet behavior, information sources for protecting yourself online, knowledge of various protective behaviors, and negative experiences with security and privacy. And these questions were drawn from Pew surveys and other pre-existing, pre-tested surveys. So in internet behavior, we asked whether people ever use the internet for social media, to apply for a job, to buy products, et cetera. In the case of information sources, we asked where the person turned for advice about protecting their personal information online. We also asked about whether they already felt they knew enough about things like choosing strong passwords, managing privacy settings, and protecting their security when using public Wi-Fi. And finally, we asked whether they had ever had one of a series of negative experiences. In order to compare these different samples, we did a statistical analysis question by question, and we looked both at the overall samples and at subgroups in the samples divided out by age and by education. And if you're interested in checking our statistics or looking at the code that was released with the paper. OK, so overall, we find that both of the online samples, so both the panel that was census representative and the crowdwork sample, are significantly more likely to report engaging in a variety of online behaviors. So they did more of all of the behaviors that we asked about. The census representative web panel in particular was more likely to report having had a bunch of the negative experiences. So they were more likely to report having had an account hacked at some point in time, having lost a job because of something they posted online, et cetera, perhaps because they are more active on the internet or are more aware when these negative experiences occur. Amazon Mechanical Turk workers were more likely to report account hacks or having their information stolen, but equally as likely as the general population in the other categories. Both of the web samples were significantly more likely to report seeking advice about protecting their information from websites, which is perhaps not surprising given that they are online far more and report more web use. And this is especially true for the Amazon Mechanical Turk workers. They are also more likely to report seeking advice at all, and both web panels were more likely to have sought advice from more sources. So they seem more interested in seeking out information on online protection than the general population. Finally, the census representative web panel in particular was less likely to feel that they knew enough about various security and privacy topics, except for passwords. And in general, all of the samples felt similarly about knowing enough about passwords, and over 80% of them thought they already knew enough about creating strong passwords. We, of course, didn't assess whether they were correct in their knowledge, but they at least seemed done with learning more about passwords. OK. We then wanted to take a look at whether these differences changed if we look just at certain age groups. And what we find is that Amazon Mechanical Turk is actually a pretty good representation of the US population for those between 18 and 29 years old. So out of the 28 questions that we looked at, Amazon Mechanical Turk differed on only 6 of those questions. Most of them were internet use questions, so being more active online. For those between 30 and 50 years old, MTurk and the panel performed similarly, although they had differences on different topics. And neither of the samples performed particularly well for people who are 50 years of age or older. And these folks make up over 30% of the US population. So a lot of the results of surveys we have currently on security are not capturing the experiences of or opinions of those who are over 50. When we look at education, we see a little bit of a different story. So for those who have a high school education or less, only the census-representative web panel has enough participants with that educational group for us to actually make a comparison. There are very, very few people on Amazon Mechanical Turk who don't have at least some college education. And the panel does a relatively good job of representing the experiences of those with lower education. On the other hand, MTurk is more similar to the US population for those who have some education. And MTurk differs in terms of online behavior for those who have some college and also who have at least a bachelor's degree. So we're still seeing that higher level of activity online. In order to try to see if we could improve the quality of the Amazon Mechanical Turk data, we tried doing demographic weighting. So in other survey methodology areas where people are doing surveys about smoking cessation or sexual health, they found that doing demographic weighting, despite the lack of random sampling, actually helped. In our case, it had very little impact. And the fact that there were significant differences for the census representative web panel and that the demographic weighting didn't really help much suggests that the differences in security behavior may have more to do with things like internet skill and security experience than with demographics. So weighting on demographics may be weighting on the wrong factors. So what does this mean in terms of how you actually go about picking a sample for your survey? If you need to generalize to everybody in the United States, then you basically need to use a combination of samples. You need to pay for one of these probabilistic or nearly probabilistic kind of samples, or we need to do some additional statistical work to see if we can come up with better weighting variables that we can use to correct Mechanical Turk, especially for those over the age of 50. If you're OK generalizing to only a certain subset of the population, then for those who are 50 or under and have some college education, Amazon Mechanical Turk is a pretty good approximation. For those with a high school education or less, the panel is a decent approximation, and it's a better approximation for those over 50 than MTurk, although still not great. So in terms of future work, we need to work on developing additional statistical mitigations, so figuring out the right weighting variables for online security surveys, which, asking people questions about the internet while they are online is fundamentally different than asking them about their health behavior through an online survey. And we also need to take care in acknowledging our limitations. So if we're using MTurk surveys, we are often missing a large portion of the population who may be especially vulnerable. And this can also be true even for the census representative surveys as well. So this sometimes calls for specialized work, particularly with these populations, when it's a research question that's especially relevant to them. So in summary, we wanted to explore the generalizability of security and privacy survey results. We compared a census representative web panel and Amazon Mechanical Turk to a probabilistic telephone survey that represented the United States population within a confidence interval of 2.7%. We found that MTurk is pretty good for those 18 to 50 with some college education. And if you're interested in learning more about designing surveys and the math behind statistical weighting and et cetera, I point you to this white paper. Thank you, and happy to take questions now.
Thanks so much. We have plenty of time for questions.
Luke Desitaus from Samsung Research America. Now that we have these results and we're aware of the limitations of MTurk, for example, which is used very, very often in a lot of these research papers, what would your advice be to paper reviewers who now need to judge whether a survey is sufficient or if the authors need to go and maybe instead of just an MTurk survey, they should go do even more, something more representative? What advice would you give to reviewers now that we have this information?
Sure. So I think a lot of this really has to do with what the authors are trying to claim. So if I'm making a tool that is targeted at people who are particularly privacy sensitive or particularly educated or something like that, and I do an MTurk survey, that's probably all right. If I'm trying to make a claim that some new tool is going to solve a lot of problems, especially for a marginalized population, then you may want to see even a survey that's specialized to that population. So one thing I didn't talk about is you can reach out to a survey company and just get those who are over 50 or just get those who have a high school education or less. So I think a lot as a reviewer is looking at what are people really trying to do here, and are we kind of caveating accordingly.
Hi, Julia Hansen from University of Chicago. So in recent years, it seems like MTurk has had a quality crisis. I know recently when I ran an MTurk study, we had a lot of people using VPNs to access US surveys who were from outside of the US. So I was wondering if you encountered this kind of quality crisis, and if you had any advice for researchers as to how to mitigate that or how that affects the generalizability of MTurk results.
Sure. Yeah. So for the data presented here, we actually had a data set both from 2017 and from 2018. So we were checking like time differences and also MTurk data quality. At least between those 2 years with these kind of like has X ever happened to you questions, we didn't see a lot of differences. That said, recently I know the VPN thing has upticked a lot, beating some of the Qualtrics and MTurk controls that were in place before. It would be interesting to collect a data set and see if it's changed. I think a lot of this is like a cat and mouse game, right? People get paid better if they take US tasks, and so they want to do that, and then MTurk and Qualtrics and researchers come up with new mitigations, and we go back and forth. That is an advantage you get from the panels. They do usually verify mailing addresses. We didn't run into those issues here, but I think it's always a concern and sort of emphasizes the need for sometimes collecting more than one sample from more than one platform to make sure something wonky didn't happen.
So Tobias Fiebig, TU Delft. So I was wondering, the US are not the world, especially not in the internet. Do you have an intuition if this would be different in other countries?
Sure. My suspicion is that MTurk would be more representative of people with even higher educations in other countries. So I think in the US, like the fact that MTurk is capturing the some college to bachelor's was actually a little bit surprising to me. That would be the main thing that comes to mind to me as a difference. Also, the age gap might shrink a little bit, but I don't actually know. So that's my hypothesis, but I have it on the list to try to check for other countries.
Well, let's thank the speaker one more time.